Hi, this is Mr. Guy, and we're going to be going over the bureaucracy, and we're going to be doing this for our next assignment. And I want you to take notes on the bureaucracy, and I want you to watch the videos. You might have to come back and forth between the PowerPoint and the videos to watch. There'll be a few of them. Some of them are going to be crash course, some are going to be different things. At the end, after this, after you take notes on this, there'll be one basic quiz on the bureaucracy. It'll probably be 20, 30 questions on it, not a whole bunch of them. You can use and take your notes and turn them in with this assignment. The basic enduring question is, how does the bureaucracy carry out laws, implement policy, and interact with the executive, legislative, and judicial branches? So that's the basic enduring question for this unit. Ronald Reagan once said, "You can't be for big government, big taxes, and big bureaucracy and still be for the little guy, like the small person." What is the bureaucracy? It's a vast hierarchical organization of executive branch employees ranging from the president's cabinet to accountants at the IRS that take care of the federal government's business. So it includes the White House staff, it includes the executive office of the president, it includes government corporations, it includes government regulatory agencies, and independent executive agencies. Political authority over the bureaucracy is shared by the president and Congress. Typically, Congress authorizes the money and sets it up, and the president actually says, here's what he wants. Federal agencies share functions with related state and local agencies. So the bureaucracy basically is the group that gets things done. Congress passes a law, and the bureaucracy actually has to put the law into effect. Hierarchical. All bureaucracies are basically hierarchical. The federal government provides many services, maintaining interstate highways, coordinating air traffic at airports, protecting borders, enforcing laws, delivering mail, etc. For each of these services, Congress has passed a law previously and created one or more executive branch departments or agencies to carry out the responsibilities of government. Sometimes the bureaucracy is referred to as the fourth branch of government. It's comprised of all agencies, departments, offices, and bureaus in the executive branch, primarily responsible for implementing and enforcing and basically executing the laws. So, like I said, there are independent regulatory agencies, there are independent executive agencies, there's departments like the Department of Defense, Department of State. There are White House offices and offices in the executive branch, and there's bureaus like the FBI, CIA, and so on that are all underneath the president. This is a video on bureaucracy basics, so you can either try to click on the link on bureaucracy basics or that the picture of bureaucracy basic, it goes to crash course. It'll actually take you to YouTube, and then you do need to come back here and come back to the PowerPoint. Make sure you take notes on the video, and after you take notes on the video, then come back to the PowerPoint. We began our country with the spoils system, and then we went to the merit system. To the victor belongs the spoils. That was in 1828 with Andrew Jackson. He created the spoils system, the patronage system, and it was used for filling federal jobs. President rewarded his supporters with jobs based on service, based on helping him in with a campaign, helping him, being his friend. It was not based on merit. President Garfield in 1881 was assassinated by a disappointed office seeker. And because of that assassination, we had the creation of the Pendleton Service Act of 1883. It eliminated the spoils system and created a merit system, an exam-based merit system to fill government jobs. There is a civil service exam. Typically, they're between 3, 4, 5 hours to do the job. And there's specifically, like if you have a postal job and you want to be a postal worker, it's one test. If you want to work in the State Department, it's another test, and so on. But they have skills that they want to test you on. You also have an application process. You also have to go through an interview process. The Civil Service Commission was created to administer the exams. The Hatch Act was passed in 1939. That revolves around political activities of bureaucrats. They're limited. They can't be basically people in the government can't be involved with politics and actually campaign in the office and use their office for political purposes. We had in 1978, the Civil Service Reform Act. This abolished the Civil Service Commission but created the Office of Personnel Management to provide guidelines on hiring and firing, and that'll be later reformed later on. The Pendleton Act. This is a little bit more detail on the Pendleton Act. It was brought about by an extreme case of patronage, assassination of James Garfield by Charles Guiteau, because Garfield denied his request for a political office position. The Department of Defense has the largest number of civil service employees, followed by the U.S. Postal Service. Overall, the federal civilian employment has not increased in decades. It's been right around 2 million, 2.2 million, indicating the bureaucracy is not actually growing. Bureaucrats are not easily removed from office, and we'll go over that later. Typically, what we find is the increase in government positions is in the private sector, where you have people working for the NSA, but not in the government, but actually through private corporations. People are working for the Defense Department, not in the Department of Defense, but working for corporations that work for the Department of Defense. The Hatch Act meant to distance federal employees as well as state employees paid with federal funds, not from politics. This prohibited federal workers from becoming directly involved in political campaigns. It basically got criticism from many people because it interfered with the First Amendment rights of free speech and free association for people. The Federal Employees Political Activities Act softened these statutes. Federal employees can not use their political official position to influence or interfere in an election, cannot engage in political activity while on duty, while using a government vehicle, or while in official uniform. They can express opinions about candidates. They can contribute funds to political parties and to candidates. They can attend political functions, but it's after hours, not during their job, and not on using government computers in office. Here is a video about the Hatch Act, so please go ahead and click on that. Take notes on that. It basically explains it a little bit more, and then we will move on to the next slide. Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976, promising to change Washington and reform the bureaucracy. He abolished the Civil Service Commission and created the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, which basically recruits and recommends individuals, oversees promotions and other employee issues. The Merit Systems Protection Board protects the rights of employees. And then there was the SES, the Senior Executive Service system that placed more emphasis on a bureaucrat's skills and experiences than on the job. It was basically trying to create a way to fire and hire and have more control over senior executives. The executive branch, the executive hierarchy, is a vast structure of governing bodies created by professional bureaucrats. They include departments, agencies, commissions, and a handful of private-public organizations known as government corporations. So there's cabinet departments. There's 15 cabinet departments. There's regulatory agencies, which are independent, and they basically do 3 different functions. They actually create laws, enforce laws, and basically interpret the laws. There's government corporations like the United Postal Service, and there's independent executive agencies, and that's like the FBI, and we'll go through each one individually. Cabinet departments. There are 15 cabinet departments that oversee and administer various policy issues. So basically you have Secretary of State, Department of Treasury, Department of Defense, the Justice Department, the Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, and so on. Each has their own staff and their own budget. Department of Defense is the largest, and each is supervised by a secretary. Even though the Attorney General is not the secretary, it is the actual head of the department. So there are 15 different ones for the executive departments, and this is the cabinet for the president. The presidential line of succession depends on the cabinet and which one was created first. So you have basically the president, number 2 is vice president, then you look at Speaker of the House, President Pro Tem, the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, all the way down to Homeland Security, and after that. So you're basically looking through all of those based on when they were created. So that is the presidential line of succession. And typically one of the smaller ones, whether it's energy, education, veterans affairs, or Homeland Security, is not at the State of the Union during this time. All the other departments, the cabinet secretaries are there. The president oversees the executive branch through 15 departments. At formal cabinet meetings, the secretaries sit in seats based on the age of their department, oldest seated closest to the president. Departments contain agencies that divide the president's goals and workload. The Department of Homeland Security has immigration, customs enforcement, Coast Guard, transportation, security administration, all dealing with protecting the country and its citizens. The FBI is one of the most notable agencies in the Justice Department. The IRS is the nation's tax collector, and that's within the Treasury Department. And here is President Trump's. This is his cabinet with, it's kind of old because you have Jeff Sessions in there, but I'll get another picture there. You also have Secretary of State. And these is like his first cabinet. 3 types of independent agencies. There are 3 agencies. 1, regulatory agencies, independent regulatory agencies, independent of the president, often exercise quasi-judicial, quasi-legislative powers. These are the ones that basically will help create laws, enforce laws, and give out punishments. So you have like the FCC, which is the Federal Communications Commission. Basically, that one would create and say what is not able to be said on the radio or TV. They'll actually create the laws and say, okay, this is not allowed. Then they'll enforce it, and they'll actually go to people and say, you're breaking the law, and then they'll actually give punishments, whether it's fines or, do something like that. Independent executive agencies subject to presidential control. They're similar to cabinet departments. This might be the FBI, the CIA, in their agencies that do not regulate, but they're just doing one different function. And then you have government corporations, subject to presidential control, but they're set up to carry out business functions, and they're created to actually work like a corporation. Amtrak is another one besides the Postal Service, which are basically, they're run like corporations to actually help work in the executive branch. Independent regulatory agencies, the FDA, FCC, FAA, they oversee a particular aspect of the economy. They create regulations that protect people, can enforce regulations by judging disputes. They're headed by a commission confirmed by Congress rather than a secretary. They're closely involved with interest groups that want to influence regulations. So some examples are the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the Federal Communications Commission, that's FCC. This is a video about Trump and the EPA, and he was actually trying to do some action executive order with the EPA, so click on that, take some notes on that, and then come back to the PowerPoint. The FDA bans trans fats. This is another video about the FDA and a regulation. This is with CNN, so go ahead and watch this video and then come back. Cable television is regulated by the FCC. Food labeling is by the Federal Trade Commission. Meat inspection is by the FDA. Pollution control by the Environmental Protection Agency. Airline safety by the National Transportation Safety Board. Safety and reliability of home appliances by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Seatbelt mandates by the National Highway Traffic Safety and Administration. Mediation of labor disputes is by the National Labor Relations Board, and coordination of relief efforts by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. These are all examples of different commissions and agencies that are regulatory. Government corporations, they perform services for a fee like a private business. The United States Postal Service is the largest. It's a hybrid of government agency and a private company. Began in the 1930s and usually come into being when the government wants to overlap with the private sector. Here are some other examples of government corporations: Amtrak, Tennessee Valley Authority, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Independent executive agencies, all other executive bodies, most created for specific purposes, like NASA. Heads are appointed by the president, so they usually have some partisan motivation. Although they are supposed to be free from public influence, president appoints and the Senate approves and confirms. Although they're organized like cabinet departments, they do not have cabinet status. NASA, CIA, National Science Foundation, Smithsonian. Typically, they might have longer terms. They might have longer terms than just 2 to 4 years. Bureaucrats as implementers. When Congress creates departments and agencies in the executive branch, it defines the organization's mission and empowers it to carry it out. So the actual bureaucracy is the one that basically gets the stuff done. Bureaucrats are implementers. They enact and enforce rules, procedures for putting Congress's policy decisions into practice, work out details and guidelines, and assign responsibilities among bureaucrats. They oversee the day-to-day operation of the federal government. Policy implementation is not always successful once a program is up and running for various reasons. There are structures, rules, and overlapping jurisdiction. Sometimes there's a lot of red tape that slows things down. Efficiency of the bureaucracy. The only thing that saves us from the bureaucracy is inefficiency. That's Eugene McCarthy, Democrat from Minnesota. There's duplication. Congress has a tough time establishing clear laws and clear goals, which leads to creation of multiple entities to manage or oversee activities with marginal differences. Exclusive authority on a responsibility is rare. So a lot of times different departments do the same thing. So there's duplication. The FBI and DEA is the Drug Enforcement Agency. Both apprehend drug dealers. Army and Navy provide military support, military rules. NSA seeks foreign intelligence. This duplication creates competition, causes jurisdictional issues, creates basically arguments, fights, expands government costs, frustrates taxpayers. These rules of creating these competing governments can slow down things, can slow down what happens, and basically makes the government more efficient because you have duplication, creates competition, issues, expands the cost, and frustrates taxpayers. Red tape. Most common complaint among the U.S. citizens about government is red tape, the vast amount of paperwork, procedures, forms, formal steps a citizen must take to accomplish a government-mandated task. Government restrictions on an agency decisions and purchases contribute to slowing down bureaucratic decision-making. In many cases, agencies must meet contingencies before moving ahead on projects. They must get approval. They must fill out paperwork before they can move on to something. Here's a cartoon about the federal bureaucracy. So go ahead and look at that and just see how it relates. Showing the inefficiency. Public impression of the bureaucracy. Bashing bureaucrats has been fashionable for decades, has become a favorite scapegoat for politicians promising to reform government, largely because so many people have negative experiences with red tape. The public has been primed to focus their resentments on this entity, the bureaucracy, despite the fact that most desire the government services that agencies' officers intend to speak positively about individual encounters with bureaucrats. This is a video. You go ahead and click on this and then come back to the PowerPoint. Take notes on this video. Tasks of the bureaucracy: writing and enforcing regulations, enforcement and fines, testifying before Congress, and then iron triangles. Writing and enforcing regulations, legislation that creates and defines the departments and agencies, often given wide latitude as how they administer the law, so the bureaucrats have to determine how the law is basically written. Laws are often vague in the directives of these agencies, and appointed officials who sit on the boards are more removed from political pressures than the heads of departments and agencies that fall within them. So typically the independent agencies and the regulatory agencies will fill in the blanks and fill in the spaces. Clean Water Act, the nation's water should be free of pollution in order to protect the health of our citizens and preserve natural habitats. Individuals or companies shall not pollute the nation's waters, airs. They shall be fined or jailed in accordance with the law. The EPA shall set pollution regulations, shall have the authority to make rules necessary to carry out this act. That is very vague. So then they have to actually determine the rules and regulations, what these mean. Because legislators are not experts in this field, the authority is delegated to the EPA, and their mission is to carry out this act and make the regulations. They're the experts, and they do this, not Congress. Here is another video. So go ahead and watch this video and then come back to the PowerPoint. Like a court, the agencies, commissions, and boards within the bureaucracy can impose fines and other punishments. One key aspect of enforcement is compliance monitoring, making sure firms and companies that are subject to industry regulations are following those standards and provisions. Testifying before Congress, federal employees in the many departments, agencies, and commissions and boards within the bureaucracy are experts in their fields. They'll give advice, they'll give information. They frequently appear before the congressional committees to provide expert testimony. Iron triangle is one we've learned about before. It's a relationship between an agency, congressional committee, and interest group. It's called an iron triangle because the three-way independent relationship are so strong. The 3 points of the triangle join forces to create policy, establish tight relationships that are collectively beneficial, private interests. Bureaucrats have an incentive to cooperate with congressional members who fund and direct them. Committee members have an incentive to pay attention to interest groups that reward them with donations. Interest groups and agencies generally are out to advance their goals for policy and to help out with their different areas in that functions. And here's an example of an iron triangle. So you've got the bureaucracy, the interest group in Congress, and that's the committee. That's the agency, and that's the interest group. And here is iron triangles explained. This is a video. This is from Hip Hughes. So go ahead and watch this, take notes on it, and then come back to the PowerPoint. Political action committees, an organization that collects political donations from its members, uses the funds to influence election, either by supporting or opposing candidates. We've gone over this with interest groups. Issue networks. We went over this briefly, but this is a little bit more. They're different from iron triangles. They're more common now than iron triangles. They're about public interest. They include committee staffers, often those experts and authors of legislation, academics, people from universities, think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, the Brookings Institute, advocates, interest groups, and/or members of the media. These experts and stakeholders collaborate to create specific policy on one issue. Multiple actors and institutions interact to produce and implement possible policies. Discretionary authority, the power federal executive branch officers have to shape the enforcement of policy through instruction, directives, personal interpretation of the laws. Congress has granted departments, agencies, bureaus, and commissions varying degrees of discretion, developing rules and interpreting legislation. And this is discretionary authority because the laws that were created were typically vague. The executive branch and the departments basically have the authority to basically develop rules, interpret legislation, and then enforce it. Rulemaking discretionary authority. The constitutional basis for bureaucratic departments or agencies stems from Congress's power to create and empower them. Congress guides and funds them. The legislative branch decides on the broad principles for law. Details emerge during debate over policies. Congress leaves the specific regulations for implementing the policy up to the members of the bureaucracy. So they create the law, and then the bureaucracy then comes up with the different regulations, the rules about the law. Examples of bureaucratic legislative power. This quasi-legislative powers enables the FCC to determine what is indecent for television broadcast. EPA intervenes in state environmental issues. Homeland Security allows certain exemptions for immigrants. Transportation determines which highway projects get grants. Education cancels or lowering student debts. TSA monitors passengers boarding airplanes, who will be searched and how. Laws are made in a public manner. Agency rulemaking process and schedule availability to public to advance to allow relevant players to participate in the process. Representatives and other issues, commissions, and basically laws are made in a public manner, and then the rulemaking process and what happens there with the legislative powers, they actually create the laws, regular players to actually enforce the laws and do that. Here is with Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake in the Super Bowl, and this is a video about the end of that. Is Supreme Court case with that. Interpreting policy, the DREAM Act 2009. Sorry, that's 2013. Secretary of Homeland Security said agencies in her department would not arrest or deport illegal immigrants who had come to the U.S. as children. The Attorney General Eric Holder and the Obama administration revised approach to enforcing marijuana violations. Trump's Attorney General Jeff Sessions declared local U.S. attorneys, those presidentially appointed prosecutors who bring federal crime cases to the court, in their each county, they shall be determined how federal marijuana policy is handled. So Trump's Attorney General did a little bit different than the Obama administration, but they gave the local area attorneys basically power if they wanted to bring a case or not. So basically, the bureaucracy interprets the policy and what they're going to enforce and what they're not going to enforce. Holding the bureaucracy accountable. Who's responsible for bureaucratic decisions? Congress basically creates the big picture, the laws, and some of the regulations. The president shapes the departments, agencies when appointing his cabinet secretaries and agency directors. The courts challenges department directives and agency rulings come in the courts, which may uphold or overrule the executive branch body. Interest groups and industry is there to influence regulations or enforcement. With so many players, it's difficult to tell whom the bureaus and administrators answer to, especially when you've got Congress, you've got the president, you've got the courts. What should happen when these policies should go through? It's almost like when every law goes through, there's going to be a lawsuit, and there's going to be so many players that actually get involved that you have to get some time to see what actually happens. Congressional oversight. The bureaucracy's discretion and rulemaking authority raises many questions. Congress passed the Administrative Procedures Acts in 1946 to better guide agencies in developing their policies. The APA assures that those who will be governed by a policy can have input into shaping it. Notice and comment authority for opportunity for citizens to voice concerns. There are committee hearings. It is a check and balance on the agencies themselves and over the president's influence on them. House and Senate committees hold oversight hearings to address agency action, inaction, or the relationship with the agency. The list of standing House and Senate committees parallels a list of notable agencies. House Committee on Homeland Security has jurisdiction over the Department of Homeland Security. Committees and subcommittees receive reports from directors, from their agencies, from their employees that are called to testify. Sometimes these are routine collegial encounters that the agency is there just to update Congress on how it's doing, their goals, their plan. Sometimes the committee has authorization to actually look at and see any questions and see what's going on with the bottom line and what's happening in this. So sometimes they're just typical routine encounters. Sometimes they're basically there to find out, is there any problem? Is there any issue? Veterans Affairs scandal. The VA department showed serious mismanagement and failures to serve U.S. military veterans. Among the allegations were long wait times at VA hospitals to get medical attention and bureaucrats falsifying records. One report alleged that the average wait time for a veteran was 115 days. Sometimes it was even longer than that, but that was just the average, was 115 days. Here is a video on lawmakers blast VA officials. So it's like a short video on that. So when you come back here. Power of the purse. Congress decides how much funding these organizations receive. With the power of the purse, Congress can determine the financial state of an agency and its success when it allocates money. The agency cannot spend public funds until a committee or subcommittee first passes authorization of spending measures. These state the maximum amount the agency can spend on each certain program. The agency does not receive funds until each House Appropriations Committee and the full chamber also approve the funding. These appropriations are usually made annually as part of the federal budget. Here is Trump's budget proposal. You see the Defense Department going up 10%, Homeland Security up 7%, Veterans Affairs 6%, and then all of the negative ones below there, with the EPA minus 31%. Power of the purse continued. Some agencies do not require a congressional appropriation. Federal Reserve Bank makes money through its systems of charging interest to commercial banks. Postal Service is self-sufficient as well. It doesn't lose any money, and it makes it through basically their stamps and their charges. Others charge fees and fines as supplemental operating costs, making them a little less beholden to Congress, at least when it comes to asking for money. The final say, because Congress and agencies share a good deal of authority, an unclear area of justification has been created. One procedure that is developed to sort out any overlap is committee clearance. Some committees have secured the authority to review and approve certain agency actions in advance without passing a law. Although this isn't legally binding, most agency heads will not ignore the wishes of committees funding because it's funding. Legislative veto, established in the 1930s to control executive agencies. It was a requirement for certain agency decisions must wait for a defined period, either 30 or 90 days. Congressional attempt. This was a congressional attempt to give itself power over the executive branch. It was declared unconstitutional with a Supreme Court decision, which you're going to see next. So this is the Chatter decision, ended the use of the one house legislative veto, where the Congress could basically veto an action of the president. So go ahead and watch this video. Here's the Whistleblower Protection Act of 1989, passed by Congress in 1989 to prohibit a federal agency from retaliating or threatening an employee for disclosing acts that he or she believes were illegal or dishonest. Citizens in a democracy want transparency in government, often encourage such acts and exposure. Bureaucrats and the courts. Bureaucratic agencies interact with courts in a variety of ways. Implementation of some rules can result in prosecution of an offender in a criminal trial. Agency fines and punishments can be appealed. U.S. Supreme Court has shaped how Congress can interact with agencies and empower the agencies wider latitude to enact their missions. The courts and the bureaucracy. Here is the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Most judicial hearings challenging agency decisions and regulatory punishments are looking for a complicated interpretation of law, its application, or constitutionality. These concerns for the appeals court. Super Bowl halftime show, the FCC punished Viacom, CBS parent company, and the network's lawyers challenged the ruling in a Third Circuit Court of Appeals. The federal court overruled the FCC and sided with CBS and Viacom. Over the last few decades, these appeals courts have often enabled executive authority more than checked it. Supreme Court does not take many cases when appealed from circuit courts. Some appeals have basically, the appeals courts have largely become the final say in agency decisions. Unless agency discretion is blatantly unlawful or abusive, basically deference is to the agency. Here are the 11 Circuit Court appeals. So you can see the DC Circuit in Washington, then you've got 11 with Arizona. We're in the 9th Circuit Court there. Chevron versus the National Resources Defense Council. Supreme Court has yielded a bureaucratic authority when the language in the statute that defines their authority is vague. When Congress bestows power on an entity it creates, but has perhaps failed to explicitly define scenarios or rulings that the agency might make, the court recommends erring on the side of the bureaucracy. The case which governs this approach is Chevron versus the National Resources Defense Council. Chevron Oil was pitted against an environmental protection group. The question was what degree an agency can set standards when governing what power is incomplete or vague. Clean Air Act of 1970. Clean Air Act of 1970 requires states to permit programs for new or modified plants that might affect pollution. EPA passed a regulation that grouped plants into a bubble area for pollution measurement. NRDC challenged the EPA in order to protect the air. District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals set aside the EPA regulation, and it was appealed by the Circuit Court. The Supreme Court overruled the DC Circuit Court and established the doctrine under which courts are supposed to defer agencies when their responsibilities are vague or ambiguous. Under this concept, agencies only determine what the law is and what they can change and interpret at any time. They can also change, interpret laws, do that at any time. So that's the Clean Air Act of 1970. That's the end of the bureaucracy. So if you could take notes and go back on this and look at this, there will be basically a quiz on these different slides. And if you have any questions, feel free to post, and please feel free in office hours. But this is about the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy is under the executive branch. The bureaucracy is created by the Congress. It's also regulated by the Supreme Court and the courts. And it does work with state and local governments. So the bureaucracy is part of the federal government branch and is part of the executive branch. Thank you very much, and you have a good day.